Hello, I'm Simon, and in this video I'm going to show you the basics of Houdini. In this first part, we're going to talk about the interface. Opening our Houdini will look like this. So here on the left side we have actually our main 3D view. Then on the right side from this, at the bottom here, we have where our notework will be created. Then above this will be our parameters from the node. Further, we also have here some presets, or called shelf tools in Houdini. So you can click them to create, for example, a cube, lights, and so on. At the bottom here, we also have a timeline if you want to start animating things here. We can also hide the timeline quickly here with this button. Then further in our 3D view, we're gonna have to hold Alt or Spacebar to move with our mouse. So we can just click, we can scroll, and we can middle mouse click also to pan the view. Now further here on the side of this view, we actually have options to then move, scale, rotate, and so on, and also snapping here, but more on that later. Also then here on the other side, we also have here different options for showing the grid, light, point view, and so on. Let's start with creating our first node. We can either, like I mentioned before, we can use the shelf tool, so we can click the box here, and you can see that we can actually place a box in the scene or press enter to put it in the center. So this is how we can add a box, for example. Other ways we can do is just press the tab button in the node view, and then we can type in box. And I have a second box here as well, which is automatically placed in the center. So to move the box, we can use the handles over here, and I can move my box around. And you can also see here that in our parameters menu, we have here our translation of the movement. We can also here fill in custom values to rotate it and scale it and so on. Something very important when you start working in Houdini is to know in what level you are. So right now we are in object level, and when I double click on my box here, for example, we are jumping now to a geometry level. So this is very important to know on what level you are. There are some specific namings for this. So this is actually called the SOP level, where we have SOP nodes, which stands for surface operator nodes. And here we just have the normal object level, where we just place objects like lights, general geometry, and so on. Most of the time we're going to actually dive in here into the geometry network, and from here we can start doing extrudes, bevels, unwraps, and so on. We can also modify our interface even more. What we can do is we can here drag this around these spacings here. You can also see these arrows here, so we can actually collapse this view, and we now press P, and now we have a small parameter menu. So with P, we can show this menu. So that was it for this video, quickly showing you around the interface and how to place nodes. Hello, welcome to the second part. In this part, I'm going to show more about the base geometry nodes in Houdini. So previously we have here a box. So I can actually go in this box, and now we are here on the geometry level. A box is one of the default geometry you have here. What's also interesting here is at the top we actually have the geometry type. So now it's set to polygon, but we can also set it, for example, to polygon mesh. When you set this to polygon mesh, you can also see that actually the axis division is now being enabled. And now we could start increasing this value. At the moment you don't really see this in the view. That is because the wireframe is not enabled. To show the wireframe, I can go here to this cube. We are now in smooth mode, and I want actually a smooth shaded with wireframe. So now we can actually see the wireframe. If you want the shortcut for this, we're going to press Shift W to switch between the shade wire view. You can also just press W to see the wireframe itself. So in here, when I hold middle mouse button, I can quickly add divisions along my cube. We also have here basic rotation, size, scaling, and so on. Notice that there is also a red box here, and with this red box, I can actually manipulate my main shape. I can also hold Shift to do an equal movement along this axis, so don't have to worry about that. I can also do Control, which will scale in all axes, as you can see. This can also be quite interesting. So remember here at the top, we're going to set it to what we want. So in this case, if you want to have cube with extra divisions, you can use the polygon mesh. If you only want, for example, points, then we just can have points only as well. What we can also do here with my box is, let's say I want to have another box, I can hold the Alt key and I can drag my mouse and I actually have a copy of my selection. So in the viewport, I now see box number 2. And what is important to know as well is the blue icon is the render flag. Whoever gets the blue flag will be rendered in the view. So if I move my cube here on the side, I see that my original cube is not showing because my render flag is not tagged there. So you're going to have to keep track of this render flag, and what you are currently viewing will be decided by this flag. We also have other ones, which is here, for example, viewing the wireframe of another node. And as you can see, I can now see the wireframe of this previous node. We also have here another option called lock. So that means that if I, for example, would lock in this node, and if I change the scale, nothing will happen because we have locked this node to its current selection. Then another one is to bypass. So whenever you click this, you can actually just skip nodes in the network. And also here further we have the node info icon. So if you click this, you can actually see more information about this node. But you don't, at the beginning, you don't really have to worry about this. That will be more for later on. You might also wonder now, how can we view these two nodes at the same time? We'll need another node for that. So I'm going to type in merge, and the merge node will be used then merge different nodes together. So when I render the merge node, I can actually see all these results. So I can move this cube around and I can see them both. And this is how you could work in the node view with placing multiple nodes, merging them, set the render view to the right node, and so on. Further, we have more geometry options in Houdini. We can just use the tab menu, type in tube, then we have a tube or cylinder. By default, again, it's not here set to actually polygon, so I'm going to switch this to polygon. Then we can here start increasing the rows and columns. We also have an option here for the rotation, so certain axis, and also we can close the caps. We can also use the handle we see here in our view to actually start scaling this to what you want. Then we also have a sphere. So with the sphere, here again, I'm going to set this to polygon. You can also switch to polygon mesh. So these both give different results. So depending on what you would like to need, you can use these. Again, we have here the rows and columns, and we can use this red box here to define the shape more. Then we also have a torus. So let's place it down here. Then I can use these handles as well to start scaling down my torus and manipulate it. Then finally, we also have a grid. So this is just a simple grid. We can then change this as well. We can have the rows and columns here again, and so on. Then what's also an interesting geometry to work with is the platonic solids. So let's place it down here. So this is the default geometry. Then we have different types. So we also have octahedron. This one is really interesting if you want to do something with rocks. This is quite a nice shape for this. We also have a soccer ball. And we also have the classic teapot. So that was it for this video. I showed you some of the basic geometries you could use in Houdini to start procedurally modeling what you want. Hello and welcome to the third part of an introduction into Houdini. In this part, I'm going to show you some of the modeling features and how we can use them in Houdini. So here again, I'm going to start out with my box. Now let's start with a more interactive way of modeling in Houdini. It's not necessarily procedural, but it's a very interactive way of working. So what we can do here is at the top, this is probably set to main, but if you click on it, we can actually have presets. So we can go down here and go to polymodeling preset. So click on polymodeling, and now it's here set to polymodeling. And when we hold the C key, we will now have a menu. So based on what you select here, let's say I want to do something with quads, you will see that this menu now changes to the quad simulation features. So since we want to do modeling, we're going to go here for polymodeling, of course. Let's say then I want to use, for example, the extrusion here. So I want to select a primitive. I'm going to press number 4 on my keyboard. And now we should be able to select a primitive. You can also see that I automatically switch to this handle And I also switched here to this primitive selection. So we also have point and edge selections. So let's click this primitive. It is now highlighted. Hold the C button. And let's say I want to extrude this and release the C key. And now we have this handle, this red handle. Just drag the handle and then we have an extrusion. I can also just scroll my mouse to do an inset, and I can now decide where they should go. On our parameter tab here, we can actually then manually fill in values or play around with the sliders. We can also twist this here. We can also give this more divisions. Like if you want to have a very smooth twist there, something like this. Now again, we can continue, press 4 on the keyboard. We're going to select the primitive. We can select multiple of them. So maybe let's select these two. Hold the C button and now extruding this again. So now we have these two faces being extruded. We can also extrude them separately. So here at the top of our poly extrude nodes. So as you can see, these nodes are being created automatically. We're going to have to go in here and set this to individual. So now they are both separately extruded instead of being automatically joined together. What is also useful to know is when I press the Q key on my keyboard, it's going to repeat the last action. So in this case, it's going to repeat an extrude. So when I press Q, you will see another extrude popping up here. So I can actually start pressing Q here a lot, and I can quickly model something like this. Now let's do some beveling. So I'm going to press 3 on my keyboard for edge selection. So you can hear again at the top, automatically went to edge selection. And I can start selecting edges when I hold shift. We can also start double clicking on edges. Let's say I double clicked, so it will select the whole loop. Also here the same, if I double click, it will select the whole loop. Also very useful is when I hold shift A, it will sort of find the quickest way to my mouse. So we can, for example, select these parts, hold the C button, and go to bevel, release it. And now the bevel is active. So I'm going to hold down my mouse and I'm going to move to the left and right with my mouse. And you can see that we have now a distance. We can also scroll with the mouse to add extra divisions. So in here, we have extra divisions there. Also, the bevel detects collisions. So let's go more extreme here with my beveling. And you can see that my bevel is now actually stopping. So I can increase this how much I want. It is going to stop because there is not enough space anymore to continue the bevel. So it automatically stops in this case to the space it has. You can go into the settings and override this so it goes further, but that will probably cause issues. And further in this menu, we have even more options, like we can do an edge loop. So let's say I want to do an edge loop, and you can automatically see here, we can create edge loops where we want to. And we can go here into the number of loops, and you can increase this like this. We also have here poly split, a poly bridge. We also have booleans, of course. We have a knife, a clip, and we have a lot more features which will not be in this video, but these are sort of the main features to start modeling. Also a note that is really cool is of course the bend node. So let's plug in the bend over here. So everything in the blue box will be bended. So if I would now bend this, you can see that it will bend that area. So the main thing you want to do here is change the blue box or the bend area. So we can scroll here at the bottom, and we have actually a button here that is the capturing region. So I'm going to switch to a certain view. So I'm going to switch to the front view. So you can go here to the different views with this short key. And now I'm going to set the region. So I'm going to click it. And from my mouse, I want to bend this from here to here. And now the blue box is there, and I can actually start bending this. So if you're able to set here a nice region, the bend will always follow what you do there. Further, we also have here twists, so we can start twisting that around. We have also the length, so we can push this further. We also have a taper, which will be useful to play around with some of the sizes here. Also here at the top of the bend, we actually also have the control in what direction it should bend. So right now it's set to the y-axis. We can also, for example, use the z-axis. So we're actually bending in that direction. Now, one thing I did not talk about is how can we just like simply move points around or primitives around. So what we can do, let's say I want to move some points here. So I'm going to press 2 to here, go to the point mode. Let's say I want to select these top ones and I just want to move it up. So you can either use here this icon here. It's called move, rotate, and scaling. You can also see the shortcuts. So it's D, R, and E. So if I just press D now, I can see a handle on that point. Let's just grab it. And when I scroll my mouse, I actually have a soft selection. So I can just scroll my mouse to have a soft selection there. In the node network, we're going to notice that there is a add node now. So this add node will save the information here about my custom point that I dragged. One important thing to know is that the add node is not something that is often used in procedural setups because it's a quite destructive way of working. I can, for example, just grab whatever I want and put it in certain directions, but it will be a very destructive way of working. So that was it for this video. I showed you some of the basic modeling features Houdini has. Next up, I want to take this also a step further and take these modeling features into a more procedural direction. Hello, in this part, I want to talk about the first steps into making a procedural model, and that is done with groups. So let's go here to our cube, and we're going to start out with an extrude node. So here in my extrude node, as I showed before, we just extrude everything. So we're going to have to specify what area I would like to have extrusion. Now in Houdini, everything has a number. So every point primitive has a number. So on the side here, I have actually options to show that. So we have points, normals, the number of primitives, and so on. So here at the bottom, I can enable display primitive number. And as you can see, my primitives have a specific number. So here we have 0, 2, and 4. So each primitive has its own number. And I can use this number to then do an extrusion. So here in my poly extrude at the top, what if I fill in number 2? My extrude will now happen here at the top. Now what we can also see is with this extrusion, I created more primitives, which also mean I created new numbers. So we also have 8 and 7 here. So whenever I create new amount of primitives, our numbers will also adjust to that. So this is a little bit procedural. So if I would go back to my box and I would change here the red cube, you can see that everything goes with it. Now the downside of this is I specifically say that number 2 needs to be extruded. So if I in here go to my axis divisions and set this to, for example, number 4, we can see that number 2 is not here on top anymore, it's here on the side. So we're going to have to make this more procedural, and that is done then with the group node itself. So this is the basic group node we have in Houdini. So in here, we're going to have to set a name. So we can give it an obvious name, like I want this to be extruded. Then you're going to have to set a type. So right now we have primitive, we also have point, edges, vertices. Then we also have here options to merge it with the existing groups and so on. Then further we have here the 4 base settings for the group. So we have base group here, we have bounding regions, we have normals, and we have edges. So here we have the base group. We can say here again number 2, and we can see here that number 2 is being selected. We can also here write some code, but that will be more advanced. What is also really interesting here is the bounding box. So we will now here see a red cube, and I can move this red cube, and everything in the cube is now selected. We also have this option here to then everything that is touching the cube will be selected. And this can also be very useful when you work procedurally, is that certain areas will then be extruded. So here, let's go back to the extrude. Instead of the 2, I'm going to remove this, and I'm going to use the drop-down menu, and here I have my group called to extrude. So everything now here in my binding box will now be extruded, as you can see. Also, what's also interesting is that we also have here more options for setting for bounding boxes. What we can do is here we can use a custom input to set custom bounds. Further here is the binormals. This is also interesting. So it will select faces based on their normal direction. So in this case, to work nicely, we're also going to have to lower here the angle. So let's set this to 0. And everything here in the z-axis will now be selected. And as you can see, we have an extrude there. So let's say I want to have a specific extrusion that is always happening at the top. We're going to have to fill in here at our top axis and the y-axis number 1. So it doesn't matter now how much divisions I add. So let's say I add way more. It doesn't matter anymore. The group will always select the primitives here at the top. And this is a really useful way to make this more procedural. Then further here we have also then a edge mode. Let's say I want to enable this. We can see that all the primitives on this edge has now been selected. So we could play around here with the minimum and maximum angle when the selection should happen. Now, some of these settings are grayed out, and that is because we are not in the edge mode. So if I would go here in edge mode, we see that we have more settings here to use. But of course, in my extrusion now, we are going to extrude edges and not the primitives. So let's say I just want to extrude everything that is on top. We can still plug in different shapes. So let's, for example, take a sphere, set this to polygon, increase the poly count. And now nothing is happening, and it is because of here the angle tolerance. So you can see here that we can play around with this. This can also be even for an animation. This is the base node for creating groups and making groups. So what is also interesting to know is that in nodes themselves, they also have options to have groups. So in here we actually have the output front, which is that primitive. What we can do is we can enable here a group that will automatically save this information. So let me copy this extrude node. I'm going to clear the group here, and I'm going to use the front group that we just created. Now we are extruding based on a previous group node from the extrude. This also works with bevel, so let me take the poly bevel. So everything is beveled now. What we can do is we can fill in here that extrude front, and as you can see, only this area is now being able to be beveled. So we can set a custom bevel here, like so. You can get more specific and, for example, do a bevel based on a certain edge group. Like you could set here these two edges. We can go here to the edge tab, and now we can say that only these edges are beveled. So we can, with groups, can get quickly specific on what area needs to be beveled. So as you can see here, I just fill in a group, and now we have here specific beveling. And like I mentioned before, this is all procedural, so I can at any point decide to go back. I can, for example, here play around with this angle. So let's say I want to have less, or I would like to have more. We can just play around with that. So we can create a more procedural modeling approach. That was it for this video. Just a very basic introduction on how we can make groups and use groups in modeling nodes. Hello, in this video I'm going to show you more about the groups. So previously I just talked about the general group node, but Houdini offers way more group nodes to be used. So in here I'm just going to make a simple gear, and I'm going to start out with a tube. So in here I have a tube, I set it to polygon, I close the caps, I've also set the height and the columns to a certain value. Now from here, what I would like to do first already is to have the gear tooth on my gear. So I will use a group range for that, and group range will then, like it said before, like it says in the naming, it will select based on a certain range. So here by default, it's going to select everything. So what you can do here is in the range filter, we can keep the 1 and set this to 2, so 1 and 2. So that means that there will be 1 skipped always. So if you would say 3, that means there will be 2 skipped in between. So in this case, it was, for example, not able to keep the 2 there because probably 50 is not a good value. Maybe if we put 51 there, we should have now a more consistent there. So now here at the top, I'm going to call this the names. Then let's place down an extrude node. And here I'm going to fill in here that extrusion group. And now I have an extrusion like this. And as you can see, one of my problems is I only want to have the side. And what my problem is, I don't want that top primitive. So there are a few ways on how we can get rid of this. At this moment, it's actually easy to get rid of because let's take a look at the primitive number. So what I can see is that number 0 is always facing at the top, and let's also check the bottom. Number 1 is always facing at the bottom. Even if I play around here with the amount of divisions, you can see that 0 and 1 is always at the top and the bottom. So what we can do here in the group range is, let's say, the start to 1, and now my top is removed, but now my bottom is selected. So I'm going to say start 2. So that's basically saying, instead of starting from 0, start from 2. So that means that the top and bottom is not selected. And now we have this. So now we have something that looks a bit more like a gear. So if I would now go here to my slider of the divisions, we have now a procedural gear. There are other ways we can do this as well. Let's, for example, here place down one of our group nodes. And in this group node, let's say I want to use this by normal. So everything that is facing up, so this is up. Let's set this to a lower angle, will be selected. So I call this primitive that is facing up. Then what we can do here then for the down primitive is the same, so -1. So primitive down. There will be a new interesting node, and that is called combining groups. So we can actually here start combining different groups and get a more specific result. You can give this a new name or use something that already existed. So let's say to extrude, and this equals to my to extrude group. So now you will see your normal selection that we had before. Now in here we have the further options to then start a union, intersection, exclusive, or subtraction. So in this case I want to subtract the top and bottom. So what I can say here is I don't want the top and the bottom. So it will be subtracted from that. And this works as well. So in some cases you might do combine different types of groups to then get the information you want. Now, since I created that up and down group, I can do another extrude node here. And instead of using that, we can fill in here, for example, up and down. And now we can actually start modeling this as well. We can create a more interesting gear. And like I mentioned before in the last video, we can enable this group. We can copy the extrusion node, and I can fill in here that extrusion front. And I can basically start modeling this a bit more. And as you can see, now I have this gear. We still have here the line in the middle. What I can now simply do is I could just place down a fuse node, and let's just increase this value. And now we have here one consistent line. So the fuse node is just fusing points together. So now if I still go back up my network here, we can see that we can still play around with that. We can also here play around with the group range node, set it, for example, back to number 2, and then we have it like this. We can also go even more, like 4. Let's say you want to have actually the invert. So let's go to the combine nodes, and in here, let's say that my extrude group is not equal the extrude group. So we have now inverted that group node, and we're extruding now that piece. So I can now have that as an extrusion. You can also still play around here with some of the modeling features. And now we have this result. Here at the end, what we can also see, since I've like twisted the model here, is that we're also fusing automatically these areas as well. So before my result was this, after the fuse, my result is like this. So what we can do is we can also use a group node here in the fuse. So from my extrusion here, we disabled our front output, and we only have here the side output. So I want to enable here the sides, because I only want to have the fuse in this area, the sides. So in the fuse node here, we want to select the side group, but you can see it's not available. And the reason why it's not available is because the fuse node is expecting a point group. So we're going to have to convert the primitive group to the point group. So we're going to have to type in promotion. And right now, my group is here stored in primitives. So here the side group. And by default, it's going to convert it to the point group. It's also important to know where your group is stored. If you want to know more information where your group is stored, we can use here the information tab, and I can see which are my point groups and which are my primitive groups. So I can always double check that here in this information menu. So now let's plug that in over here. And in the fuse node, I only want to fuse here the sides. So increasing now this will only fuse this middle part instead of the other parts. And that's it for this video. So we created a procedural gear. Hope you enjoyed it, and thank you for watching. Hello, in this video I'm going to show you how you can make game ready assets. So in here I already have a high poly of my asset. You can load in FBX files with the file node, so you can just load in your own model. Then from here I want to make my low poly. The easiest way to do this is by using the node called the game ras. So this node will automatically make a lower poly version for you. This is not default installed in Houdini, so you will need to install the SideFX Lab tools. So these are a collection of free tools that you could use. To install them, we can go here to Window, SideFX Labs, and then we will have this pop-up menu, and then we have an option here to then update and install. So click that button to install the tools. Now here in the game ras, what I also would like to do is go to bake, and I'm gonna disable auto bake. So if I would plug this in over here, it would automatically bake normal maps and AO and so on. Then here is my result. So here at the bottom of my reducing tab, we have about 15,000 primitives. Here I also have the number of primitives available, and you can see that exactly with this model, I have now 15,000 primitives. So based on this number, it will try to match this as close as possible. Further, we have here more settings here for the poly reducing. We also have here instant meshing, which is for a more quad topology. We also have here preserve quads. So if your input model is already a quad topology, we can actually preserve the quad structure there. Further here, we can enable the voxelization, which could also be interesting to do a voxel there. So now let's say I want to give this a lower poly count. So I think maybe let's say 5,000 would be a good number for this model. So now I have the result of 5,000. Then we go to the auto UVing. Let's switch to the UV view as well. So this is the layout by default. So it's done with the auto seam option. We can here play around here with the tolerance values. So you can try to find a result that you like. We also have different methods. I often like the UV in wrapping. Further on the packing option itself, we have also merge smaller islands. This can also be useful, so it will merge the very small parts together. You can also lower this with this value. For the UV view, you can also go here to the label, the markers. You can right click and we have here an option for the UV distortion. So with the merge small islands, it can happen that we easily get some distortion in our UVs. So you're going to have to be very careful with this tolerance value. So if I would disable this, you see that my UV is now not that stretched anymore. We further have here methods for the flattening, orientation, packing iteration, the padding distance, and so on. So I just recommend you playing around with different settings here and to find what you prefer. Then finally here we have the baking options. So we're going to have this location, we have the resolution, we have here the tracing mode and how far it should go. Then we can preview a certain map here. And then here we have all the maps that you would like to see. So if I would like a normal map, like the AO, vertex color, curvature, we can just enable what we want. Then we can just simply press bake. And then we will have all the results here stored in that folder. Then everything is almost done. And we can decide to now export the model with the FBX node. So with this node, I can export my model. So I just give this a proper name over here. And now I can just click export. You also have more settings here if you need something more specific. So this is the quick way of getting your low poly from a high poly. You can also decide to lower your polygons like this. It's the exact same process as this node, but this is just using the nodes themselves. So we're just going to poly reduce. We're going to do auto UVing. We're going to set some normals. And then we're going to use the maps baker from the labs tools to then bake the result. And as you can see, it's just the same baker that is built in the game res. Also good to know is that our topology right now is just being triangulated. So if you're looking for this more customized topology, like you need a character with animation, then you probably want to go to a more retopping route instead of the poly reducing way. So poly reducing is really great for like some more static environment models that you don't need to spend time on retopping, but just poly reducing. So that was it for this video. Hope you enjoyed it, and thanks for watching. Hello, in this video I'm going to show you how you can make digital assets. Creating digital assets is an important part of Houdini. So basically, digital asset is a custom tool you can make in Houdini. So that would mean then every time I would press tab here, I can just type in the name of my tool and it will show up. So here I have my gear as demonstration. This was previously made in the group videos, and I'm going to use this here to make a digital asset. There are a few ways of creating a digital asset. The first way is you can just select everything you want in the asset. We can go here to assets and create asset from selection. Another way is we can select what we need. We can press Shift C, or we can use here this icon for creating subnetworks. On the subnetwork, we're going to right click and going to say create digital asset. This menu will now pop up and we can give this a name. So I'm going to just type in demo gear. Then also here we can choose to save it in a certain location. So by default it would save under the documents Houdini files, and that's good enough for me. So I'm going to just press accept. So after pressing accept, this bigger menu will now pop up. So what is interesting here is we have here our basic tab and we have here our number of inputs. So if you need custom inputs, we can set it here. But the main menu you want to work in is here in the parameter menu. So in the parameter, we're going to create custom parameters for our interface. So here is my current tool and you can see it's actually just empty. So I would like to see some here custom parameters. So a quick way on creating custom parameters is we can go here in our network. And let's say I would like to have the number of columns here. So I'm going to grab my menu here and we can just simply drag and drop this value in here in our parameters. Then when pressing apply, it will save it in my tool. This will also appear green and it will save this into a link. So this is basically now a link to this value. So it will reference the calls value here, this name. So if I would now go back to my tool, I can see I have now a slider here. We can also here set a custom range value. So let's say I would like to even go more then 50, let's say 100, and press apply, you will now have the full range of values. And as you can now see, I can play around with this and create more variation on my gear. So at this stage, you can just go through the nodes and pick certain values you want to expose. So as you can see here now, I've created some more values. So I can change the scale, I can change the spacing here, I can change the distance of these gears, I can even go inwards, I can increase the inset, give this a twist, add more divisions. Now to make our menu a bit more readable and structured, we're going to use here folders to then structure everything. So we can here place down a folder, and we could, for example, start grouping this here. And we can give this then specific name, like here, and press apply. And now we have created here a custom folder. So we can actually structure our interface a bit more. So as you can see here on the side, we have a lot of different parameters we can use. But the most default ones are, of course, like integer and floats or a vector. Those are the most default ones you will use. Like I mentioned before, we now have here actually a reference. So this is the channel reference. So we can get this reference by just copy pasting this, or what we can do is we can right click and we can copy parameter values. You can copy parameter values with anything. So I can copy parameter values here as well. That's also a cool trick with Houdini, is copying parameter values and link to each other. And all we can do is we can copy this value, and we could, for example, say here, I want to multiply this with the gears. So if I would now have a smaller gear, these will automatically scale with them. So they would be more, so they could be more consistent. So that's also very interesting to know, is that we can start linking values to each other and use them and combine them. Also, a common thing you would do is you can, for example, use a switch node. And let's say I want to here have the invert of this. So I can choose this with a toggle. So I'm going to copy the node here, and let's create the inverse of that. And now I'm going to place the switch node in between here, like so. So the switch node will then switch between different outputs, as you can see. So we can just grab the value here again. We can expose it here. We can give this a better name. And instead of an integer, I'm going to go here and scroll till I find toggle. So it's now a toggle instead of an integer. So when I press here invert spacing, it will now switch there. So it's very useful then to quickly get different results again. So now you've made your first tool, and you can make as much parameters as you want and expand more on this menu, create more features, create more complexity to get variation, and so on. So I hope you enjoyed this video, and thank you for watching. In this video, I wanted to show you more about curves and points in Houdini. So let's start out by creating a curve. For that, I'm going to first of all make a geometry network, so we can create geometry, and in here, we're going to place down a curve. So we're going to make sure that we have this handle selected, and I'm also going to enable snap on the grid. So now I can actually draw a curve and snap it on the grid. Like so. So now we have created a simple curve. We can also here close the curve. We can also reverse that. So you can see that the polygon is reversed, but you don't always want to close this. Now what is very interesting in Houdini is now we have this curve and we have the points on the corner. We can create more points by doing a resample. So we can sort of like resample the line and increase the quality. So if I enable also here the amount of points, so you can see here the dots of the points. I can here control the length between them. So 0.1 is the spacing between each point. So if I increase this, we have lower. If I lower this, we see that we have created a lot more points. There are furthermore interesting settings here, and especially here at the top, we can actually do a subdivision. So we have now this smooth curve, or we can do also interpolation, which will keep the original curve, their points in mind. So let's do subdivision over here. And now let's start out with the copy to point node. This is a very useful node and often used in Houdini. And let's copy a box. So we're going to copy the box on the points. So we're going to have to fill in the geometry first and then the points. And as you can see, the box is now copied on the points. So my box is a bit too big here. So I'm just going to lower the scale here, like so. We can also play around here again with the spacing to get that better. So now we copied model on a line. Now an often thing you want to do as well is you want to orientate the box along the line, and we have a node for that as well, and that is called orientation along curve. So we can plug that in over here. So now the box is nicely orientated along that line. There is also another node for copying online, is copy to curve, and this will automatically orientate the cube. So this is also an interesting node to look into, but you don't always want to orient along a line, or you don't always have a line to copy on, so the copy to points will be then more the default one. Further, we also have other ways of drawing curves. So let me so we can just type draw curve. And this is actually more a drawing mode. So let me disable the snapping, so I can actually now draw a curve, as you could see. And this is only on the surface. So if I here go to projection, we see here that we have a projection plane. So if I would switch this, I would now have a different plane to draw on. You can also use custom input or screen space. So let me use a custom input. So here I have the pig head as my custom input. And I'm also going to go here to strokes, reset strokes, and now I can basically draw on this pig head and the line will nicely follow that. So I can plug in this here into my current system, and we can now see we have these boxes on the pig head. So we could merge the copy to points and the pig head here. And now we have this result. So now just clicking on the drawing here, we can just keep drawing on the pig head and draw certain cubes on his face. You could as well just plug in the pig head in here. And now you just see that we just have replaced the pig head with just boxes. So it's a more agreeable look that we have now on the pig head. So these nodes are quite powerful in use. So if you need to draw something, we can use the curve nodes, and the copy to points node is a very often used node of mine. And we can still here further play around with settings. We can here play around with the rotation. So we have an option for rotation, and we can start twisting this around. Like with this current setup, we can actually just, like you see here, can quickly make a chain tool. So what I did here is I started out with the torus shape. I just took the edit node and then stretched out the shape. Then I moved it here with the centering node, so it will just center into the middle of my world. Then I just scale it to the right size. So in here, it's just like a small part of it. And then we just copy it on the line. And the trick here then is to fill in here the right orientation modes to then have the chain look there. So I now can click to the draw curve here again, and now I have a chain tool. So this is a quite basic tool, as you could see, but then again very powerful. So that was it for this video. Hope you enjoyed it, and thank you for watching. Hello, in this video I'm going to give you an introduction into the attributes of Houdini. Attributes in Houdini are very important when you work procedurally. So this is something you should take the time for learning and understanding. So first of all, what is an attribute in Houdini? Attribute is a certain information that is stored on the geometry. So if you watched previous videos, I mentioned that we can here show, for example, the point numbers, primitive numbers, and so on, and that each number can have information stored on them. So where can I see this information is at the top here, we have a geometry spreadsheet. So here we have our attributes that are stored in the points, the vertex, the primitives, and the detail attributes. So here in the points, what is actually being saved is the position. So the P is the position, so we have X, Y, and Z, of course. So each point has its number and its position. So that's all stored in here. Then looking at other attributes, you see that there will be empty because we don't have created any attributes yet. So if you will also create UVing, then we will also create a UV attribute to store this information. Now a simple demo of this, we can, for example, create our own attribute by using the create attribute node. We can then here give it a name, so my attribute. We can set it in which class. So like I mentioned before, we have detail, primitive, points, and vertex. We can set the type, so float, integer, vector, string, and so on. You can set the precision, the size, and here the value. So let's say I want to create a new attribute that is stored in the points and give it the value, let's say 500. So if I go back to my spreadsheet, I see now that I have created a new attribute that is called 500. So you can see if any information here that you want. Let's make it more interesting. And interesting nodes here are, for example, the noise. So we have attribute noise. So that means that we will have a noise in our attribute values. You can also see here the color. So right now we are saving in our points a random color. So CD stands for color. So if I would go here to my geometry spreadsheet, we have now a color attribute, and you can see that each point has a different color value. And this is more interesting than the consistent 500 I had here, because it's just consistent over all points. So each point has a different color. Now in another video, I used to copy 2 points. And let's say I have a box on these points. We can see that the color automatically copied on the box. So if I would play around here with, for example, the element size, you can see that the color is copied on the box. So this is also interesting to know that if we make an attribute here, that some attributes will actually transfer to the box as well. Now, very interesting is Houdini by default will actually recognize certain attributes. So if I would type in here scale and press enter, it will recognize the value scale and start scaling our cubes based on that noise value. So if I would go back to my spreadsheet, this is now the new scale of my model. So we have assigned a scale to each point, and that scale will transfer then to the cube when I copy the cube on the point. So we can now play around with this value, and now we can generate some more variation. So this could already be a start of like a city generator. And we can here enable remapping and set this to everything 1 at the moment. So let's say I want to have some large buildings. So I'm going to press here and 5. So you can have that variation in there. And we further can just play around with the values like so. There are some more interesting nodes in attributes. We can also just randomize a value. So attribute to randomize. So this is a specific noise. We can here set the type of noise, like you have the general Perlin noise and other noises here as well. But sometimes you just want a complete random value, and that is here with the attribute randomizer. So by default here, it's going to fill in again a polar. We can also then here have the minimum and maximum range, and we have here more options in what we want as randomizing value. You can do the same here with filling in the scale. And in here, we go from 0 to 1. So we will probably have very small ones and larger ones. So we can just here again press a small value like so. And here under options, we have then a seed value. And this is a more random value. So we can double check this over here again. And this was a introduction into attributes. So attributes is just a certain value that we're going to save on points or primitives or vertices. And then the trick is then to actually use that information into, for example, using it to control the scale, or you can also do the rotation with this as well. And here we are now using the scale. But what if I use my normal direction? So each point has a certain normal. So what if I use the normal and randomize it? We now, as you could see here, have some random rotation in the cubes. So attributes, very powerful, very useful, but it will take some time to fully understand this and know where to use these in different situations. So I hope you enjoyed this video and thank you for watching. Hello, welcome to this video. In this video, I'm going to show you more examples of working with attributes in Houdini. So here in my scene, I have loaded a layout of a city. So this was from an image, and with the trace node, we can convert an image into here, this geometry. So then I just use the transform then to rotate this. Then let's start out with using a randomizer. So attribute randomize. So now each point will have a random value. You can see the vertex color of that. And I want to use this value in a extrude. So the idea is that each building then has a different height. So let's just rename this to height. And I only need actually one dimension because I only have one height. It either goes up or down. So right now the value goes from 0 to 1. Let's say my minimum is 1 and my maximum is something like 5. Then I'm going to use a extrude node. And here in this extrude node, we can then have here a local control, which we have attributes. For this to work also nicely, we're going to have to here set a current distance. And then my distance will then be controlled by my height attribute. And as you can see, this is actually not working. Because previously I also mentioned that attributes here are stored in either points, vertex, primitives, or detail. So right now it's stored into points, but the poly extrude is expecting that this attribute is stored in the primitive. So we're going to have to switch the attribute from a point to a primitive type. There are a few ways we can do this. We can just either go here and switch this to primitive. And as you can see, this already works. So we have some random values in there. But let's say you don't have this, we can then use a promotion. Like in some cases, you might do something complex and you just need to promote it from time to time. So we have now our original class is points and our new class will be then primitive. And then we assign here what we want, so the height, and this will then work as well. We also here have the promotion method, which is also interesting. So in here we have an average. We can also, for example, ask the maximum or the minimum. This is a more practical of how we can use attributes in an extrude, for example. We can also simply do some abstract art with this. So we can here, let's take down this sphere and increase the number of polygons here. We can then here basically copy paste this setup over here. And now we have this result. Now what I would like to do in this extrude is I want to here set this to individual elements. And what we see now is that we have now this result. So each primitive has now a different extrusion. We can play around here with the inset as well, make it like spikes. So we can play around here with the seeds, for example. And then we have this result. And like I mentioned before, we also have a noise option. So here we have the attribute noise. So here, attribute noise. So I'm going to type in here the height attribute. And notice here that we cannot set this to a primitive type. So there are no options here to set this to primitive. So that's why the promote will come in handy here. Now the height itself doesn't need to be also in a 3-dimension. 1 dimension will be fine. Then we can here also do some custom remapping. So it now goes from -1 to 1, which can also be interesting. And the cool thing here is we can actually click on animated. And now when we press the animation here, we now have actually created this animation, which is actually pretty cool. So just playing around with attributes, we can already have some sort of cool abstract animation here. Now another example here. Let's start out with a box. And now I want to actually use a bevel and an attribute together. So here on my box, I'm gonna make sure it's set to polygon mesh. We have some extra divisions here. We can increase this a little bit, so it's a bit more. Then I'm gonna create a noise attribute. And with this noise attribute, I'm gonna say 1 dimension, and I'm gonna type in a value that I would often use is called p-scaling. P-scaling stands for the overall scaling of an item. Then we're going to place down a bevel node, so polybevel. And I'm going to plug in here the polybevel. So let's increase here the bevel amount. I'm also going to open this exclusions here, and I'm going to say ignore flat edges. So it only bevels the sharp decrease there. And now with this beveling set, I can now add scaling. So scaling by attributes. So now we have p-scale, which is controlling the bevel amount. So if I go back here to my noise with the p-scale, and I can set remapping, so it goes to -1, which is of course not what you should do. So let's go from 0 to maybe a bit higher. Now we have basically created a random beveling. So this is pretty useful in certain styles where we have some random beveling. So also based on how much topology you use, this will give a cleaner result. You can further here play around with some of the seeds and scaling of that. So you can actually have some interesting effects going on by just random beveling based on an attribute. So that was it for this video. So I showed you some more examples of how we can actually use attributes and control a extrude and a bevel with it. I hope you enjoyed it, and thank you for watching.